Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So if anybody has any questions or comments at this point, we'll answer them as we can. And in the meantime, let's turn it over to the brilliant and talented Joy.
Wow, Don, what an intro. Hopefully I can live up to those adjectives. Well, I hope everybody had an awesome break, and I hope that you guys realize that housing is a topic that we are very much in love with. And even though it may not be the most exciting topic, it is a very important topic. So as we come back from the break, I wanted us to do a little activity to help me gauge who is fully engaged. And all of us have probably had about 500 Zoom meetings since the pandemic has started. But in the upper right hand of your box, there are three little dots. If you click on it, right click on it, I'm going to do it as well. I want you to put your two, excuse me, your abbreviation for your state and whether you live in a rural or a metro community. So we're going to rename ourselves. So I am Georgia and I am urban. So if you guys can go ahead and rename yourselves. Okay, we got Michigan, we've got Kentucky, Utah, Minnesota, Iowa. Good job. Now, I did cheat and I wrote down everybody's name during the break. I am very participatory. So I will be calling on you randomly. Okay, we have Illinois, that's rural and urban. Interesting. Indiana. Okay, Iowa. Okay. So let's talk about housing quantity. So, around 132 million housing units in the US represent, according to the 2010 census, there's approximately 132 million housing units, both occupied and vacant, in our country. This number represents an increase of roughly 16 million units, or roughly 14% over what it was in the year 2000. 30 million of those housing units are in rural areas, which represents 23% of the housing stock. So that means that difference of 77% is in the metro parts of the state. So 70% of the housing growth was in suburban areas, or I will say metro. Is anybody shocked by this data? And I'm looking at the spread on my screen for those who changed their names. We have a lot of rural people on this call representing various states. So I'm going to pick on last name McGregor, first name was Ma. Are you shocked by this information, or is this something that you already knew?
Well, my name is Michelle, and I am actually new to housing.
Okay.
And I'm looking at this, and I am shocked. I didn't realize that the number is as great as it is. Being that I grew up in Detroit in a very urban area, housing was always around, and then to go back home now and to see it is totally different.
Okay.
And so in when I moved to Saginaw, our population has declined, I would say 1 to 2% since I've been here in 2001. So
Okay.
we were one when I moved here in 71,000. Now we're below 50,000.
Wow.
And that
Okay.
has a lot to do with General Motors moving and a lot of people moving out of the area.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay.
Hey, Joy,
So, yeah.
there's a great question in the chat about a community that's lost population significantly, but we have a housing shortage for both home ownership and rental. We have a developer proposing 90 rental units over the next 7 years. Looking at our demographics, can we assume a fair amount of our single-family homes are owned by baby boomers? Are we at risk at overdevelopment?
Wow, that's a really good question. And after just listening to Allison talking about data, um, I wouldn't want to assume that these are baby boomers. And Kim, if you are still connected with us, do you want to take a stab at answering this?
I submitted it. Can I go ahead and?
Yeah.
Yeah, go
Um,
for it, Lindsay.
Yeah. I guess it wasn't whether we can assume. I mean, just looking at our demographics, our median age is 42. We do have a lot of baby boomers. And so in addition to this most recent development proposal, we have another developer who just put up a 30-plex apartment complex and plans to build another one, another 30-unit complex. And then we have a entire subdivision that we, the city ourselves, developed that has 52 single-family home lots available for sale and developers building there. And I've just, since I've been in this position, I'm trying to square this or understand this, how we're having population decline, although I'd like to see, I'm anxious for the new census data, of course, but how we have population. I know we're tearing down homes. We have a lot of homes that are, been dilapidated, but not quite at that same rate. And I'm worried that 10 years from now, we're going to have an abundance of housing stock that's what's confusing to me, is how we have consistent decline, not dramatic, not like some rural areas, 27%, we're looking at about 3%, 3 to 4% since the 1980s. Our peak was 8,500 in 1980, and now we're at 77, 80 or something like that. So I don't know, is it okay that we just keep replenishing with new housing stock? That should be happening because the majority of them are older than 1940s, 1950s, the majority of our housing stock, or are we overdeveloping right now?
So are the units that you're building filling up?
I wouldn't say they're only the one that just, the 30-plex is finished now, and they haven't started, they're taking applications, but people haven't moved in yet. So we don't know. We do know that of our existing rental stock, it's really hard to find places. They go very quickly. And we have about 40% on one half of town, about 40% rental. We're a town of, like I told you, 7,800, 35% is what it's showing for the rest of the community, which is pretty high for a community of our size. And then same with the housing market. I mean, there was a time last year where we had single-digit numbers of homes available for sale at one point that weren't pending. So, and the houses that are in that range of, well-kept homes, from around close to 100,000 to 170,000, I guess, would be now, go very, very quickly. They last on the market for maybe a day.
Wow, yeah, that's a sign. Yeah, so I'm not sure I really have an answer, and Elsa maybe can chime in too. I mean, I think it's a fluid situation, especially if there's, economic development activities going on. I would say if homes are selling in a day, you're probably not overdeveloped at this point. But like what things look like 10 years from now, if there's not new, younger people are not moving into the community, might be a different story. So it sounds like if you're building things, housing that, or developers are that people want, and that's a good thing. I don't know, maybe Allison, you can speak to that sort of future. I mean, it's a hard thing to balance, I think, in small communities.
It is, and I think, it really is the demand there. If there are applications pending and they're able to fill up those apartments, then that shows a sign of a mismatch of housing, which is different than an oversupply of housing. So I would be cautious before saying that we're overdeveloped. Things like surveys, something where you can quickly find out who is the demographic that's got applications in? Are there others like those folks behind it? I think would be critical. But I think that's what we're seeing now, is that what we have built from the 80s is not necessarily what the folks of the 20s are now looking for. And so, which I think is normal, you just have changing preferences. But I think you need additional like on the ground data to figure out, but yeah.
And one thing that I'll also share is that I've noticed here in my state is that when people build that new housing with all the bells and whistles, you have folks leaving existing their existing place to move into the new. So they are creating vacancies. And you mentioned earlier about things being torn down. So there is housing stock that's being removed from the inventory, but yet there's still new housing being added. So just looking at it right now, I would concur with Allison and Kim that I wouldn't say overdeveloped. There might be a mismatch. But like here in Macon, Georgia, where I live, when these new housing units with the pools and the clubhouses are being built, many folks are abandoning those old apartment complexes that were built in the 1980s that didn't have all these amenities and want to still be renters and just live in a environment where there are more amenities for a better price.
I think
So-
it's something we're kind of waiting to see because we haven't seen this sort of housing development, especially these new rentals. It's been a while since we've seen so many come on board and so much interest in building new. So we can't say for sure whether they're going to get, a lot
So
of it.
one other thing I would say is when you have a stock of housing that is very homogeneous, right? And so that the housing is the same size, the same function. In a community that is not homogeneous, what you find is that individuals are in the wrong house. And so, for example, in Lexington, Kentucky, we have a housing shortage, and that's because the senior age folks are not moving out of their starter family homes, opening up those starter family homes for new homes, and they weren't moving into kind of the smaller lot size, the high rise kind of thing, because those didn't exist. And so as soon as those started to come to be, then like that natural, people were starting to kind of migrate to their correct style of housing for the most part. So it could just be that this is the housing that we've been waiting for to free up kind of all the flow so people are in their correct housing. So I don't know, it'd be interesting to see, but I wouldn't say right away that it's overdeveloped.
Okay. So housing occupancy versus vacancy. So approximately 89% of those 132 million housing units are occupied in rural and small town communities. However, the housing occupancy rate is lower than 82%. So when we look at urban versus rural, we see that the occupancy rates are higher in urban areas. Rental rates for vacant units are higher in metro markets versus rural. So in a nutshell, in rural areas, much of the higher vacancy is due to homes being left unoccupied for seasonal, recreational, or just occasional use. Nearly 60% of all vacant seasonal or recreational homes nationwide are located in small rural towns. So for you guys that are rural, let me see who's rural. Indiana rural. Let's see, I got one Indiana. Ambrose, there we go. Thank you, Ambrose. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
Well, it catch me a little off guard, but for our organization, we're just venturing into the rural counties, so we really don't have experiences yet with our rural territories to really to know about and be able to comment on this particular question.
Okay, that's fine. Like I said, I am very participatory. You never know when I'm going to strike. But I just wanted you guys to just have a visual glimpse that it just seems to be the trend that people really are gravitating towards metro areas. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I'm not going to pose my opinion on that. But based on how this session started, you really need to gauge the needs and wants of the people that you are focusing on, those characteristics, those amenities. Do they want 5-acre lots or do they want 1/4-acre lots? A lot of things come into play. Do they want to rent or do they want to own? Those are all things that should be factored in when you guys are thinking about developing housing in your respective communities. Next slide, please. So showing the same thing that I just talked about in the previous slide, here are those vacant housing units and how it is broken out. 15% are vacant, available for rent. 8% are vacant and available for sale. 49 is available for that recreational, those timeshares, those cabins in the woods. I'm from Brooklyn, New York originally. So, but this is very common, I want to say, in the South, and even those folks in the Midwest, those ski lodges and things of that nature. And then you have 28% that are vacant for other reasons. Moving right down the list, how about Tyler? Tyler, you still with us? What do you think some of those other reasons are for those properties being vacant?
Thinking about the vacant ones that my family and kin have, it's either they're in disrepair, they're
I like
nobody
it.
is wanting to move there, or it's just outside the price range of the folks who are coming into the community,
I
even if it
love-
is in disrepair.
Hey, Joy, this is Don. On that, can I add a point?
Yes, you sure can,
I
Don.
was in a very small rural community recently, and there's 58 vacant homes in a town of 800.
Okay.
And the point just made was the case there. A lot of the homes, the parents live there, the kids grew up there, then they moved to the city. They don't want to live there, and they still own the home, and it's in disrepair, and nobody wants to spend the money to fix it up, so it sits there and kind of rots on the blocks. And it's a nice
Tyler,
thing for everybody.
Tyler is agreeing with you 100%. And that number is quite large. So yes, there are houses that are in ill repair. The grandmother or the family member has passed away. The kids don't want to live there, so it's just sitting there abandoned. So that's just something to think about. Other reasons why properties are not being sold or rented is probably due to some of the reasons that Tyler and Don just shared with us. So thank you guys for your contribution. Moving right on to the next slide, please. So I don't know if you guys can see this graphic extremely well, but I love this slide because it kind of just wraps up home ownership in rural America. So nearly 3/4 of rural Americans own their home, but the home ownership rate varied greatly by race and ethnicity. And if you jump down to the 47.1, nearly half of rural homeowners own their homes outright with no mortgage payments remaining, comprised to 32.9% of her urban homeowners. So when Allison was talking about our elderly population not moving out of their starter home, why would they want to move out of their starter home when their house is paid for? They're on reduced income, and much of their income is being used possibly for health care or for medication or just vacationing. So sorry, Allison, I'm not moving out of my starter home for that new young family because I have an asset that is paid for. So also 80% of rural homes are valued under 300,000 as compared to 70% for the United States overall. Another stat that it bothers me, but there's nothing we can really do. I talk about predatory lending, high cost loans. So it is 9.6% of high cost loans are predominantly in rural areas. But those rates are lower for suburban and rural, both tied at 6.2%. And then going to the real sad story is there's still homes in our country that don't have plumbing or fully operational kitchens. And that hurts my heart. And as housing practitioners, when we are thinking about building new homes, I really ask that folks consider building in a component for repairing existing homes. And we'll learn tomorrow about some of the programs that USDA offers that benefit homeowners living in the rural areas. But it hurts my heart to know that there are homes in our country that don't have plumbing and operational kitchens. Is anybody surprised by anything that was shared? That was fine, Allison. I'm going to pick on Kara, since your mic is open, if you're still there. Oh, you're calling from phone. Yes, ma'am, I hear you.
Yes, sorry. And I was actually, this is Kara, I was actually just trying to type a message. I wanted to make a comment that one thing that we find is, so I'm in Michigan, a rural county about an hour away from Detroit. And a lot of people are moving from the urban areas to the more rural areas in our county because the price of homes and the price of land is much cheaper. However, what they're not factoring in is the other added expenses of living in the rural areas without the public transportation or very, very slim choices. They can't afford to go to work or to get groceries, and the housing costs become too burdensome, and that's why they have to leave.
Right, right. And that's a very good point versus urban living versus rural living. Thinking about transportation, access to grocery stores, access to work, especially when you get away from public transit. We also have to factor in not everybody has cars. Down here in my neck of the woods, people are actually using bicycles to get to work. I actually visited San Antonio, Texas, and there's still people using horseback as a mode of transportation to get to work. So, I mean, it just really depends on where you are. But I was really shocked by the horse riding situation.
Joy, this is Don again. Can I?
Yes.
So I work with the Navajo Nation, and over half of the homes on the Navajo reservation lack running water.
Wow.
And it's people have a barrel in the back of their pickup, which they take and fill up, wait in line. You know, and that's occurring in our country today is sad and mind-boggling.
Yes, it is, and it's a reality.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing that, Don. So, rural rental housing, and I think, and this is just Joy's opinion, when we think about developing housing, I think many of us get really excited about building that beautiful 2-story home with the picket fence, but everyone does not want to be a homeowner. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with home ownership that you don't have to deal with when you're a renter. As a renter, you have the benefit of calling the landlord. They cut the grass, they change the light bulb, they fix the air condition, they paint the walls, they shampoo the carpet. None of that happens when you become a homeowner unless you pay for it. So what I wanted to just hit is that home ownership tends to overshadow the housing needs of renters. And you guys as participants, I want you guys, when you are in conversations in your communities, don't forget about the renters. I think many of us have started out with apartments, whether it was in dormitories, when we were in college or when we got out of college, but not everyone starts out with a home. In rural areas, residents need to rent home as an alternative to home ownership because the housing is just not there. 7.1 million rental units make up 28.4% of the rural housing stock. Housing rates are 8% lower in our rural areas, and rural renters occupy only 17% of all U.S. rental housing units. Rural renters are most likely single-family homes or in small multifamily structures. As I shared with you guys earlier, I am from Brooklyn, New York, and in our city, I will talk more about Manhattan and the Bronx if you guys are familiar with my neck of the woods. We have apartment complexes with 50 floors. That's not common down here in the South, and I don't think that is a housing style due to codes that are in place that will ever happen. So I just wanted to kind of put that food for thought out there, especially if you have lived in different parts of this country or different parts of the state. The housing stock and the way that it looks will vary between rural and metro areas. But the one thing that I would like to say is make sure that you're factoring this in, you're surveying your audience and finding out what they need, what their needs are, and what their wants are. Next slide, please. So some other stats, 43% of our rural rental housing are single family homes. 41% consist of 2 or more apartments. 12% are manufactured homes. A lot of us sleep on the manufactured housing product, but it is still a product. We call them double wides down here that are beautiful. They have stepped up the amenities that are offered, and it is still a viable product to many. So do not sleep on the viability of the manufactured housing product. A lot of our housing was built before 1960, and racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to be renters than white non-Hispanics. And all of this is from data. This is not Joy's opinion. Next slide. So the next graphic, you can find yourself on this map. The lighter blue represents less severe affordable rental housing. The little darker blue is moderately severe, indicating the availability and being able to secure affordable rental housing. It's not saying that it's not there, but based on the income of the population, it might be a stretch. We heard the term earlier, cost burden, and Allison said 35% of a person's household income is devoted to housing. So let's just look at that, $1,000. That means at least $350 of my take-home pay is going towards housing, leaving me only with, let me do my math right, $650 left to cover everything else. So the Black areas, which seems to be very concentrated on the west part of our country, but there are some sporadic areas in the southern region. But you guys up in the, I can't get my geography right, northeast, well, Midwest, this region looks pretty good. Not really having too many severe areas, so good job. Next slide. And then this is referencing USDA's Section 515 program. And of course, we have our USD expert on the line. But this is the program that provides subsidies to help folks with rental. So like I said, you can look, find yourself on the map. You can see that there's a high concentration in this region that we've been focusing on, followed by the Southeast. Not too much going on the west side of the country. Not sure why, but the legend based on the bubble size kind of shows you how many of the prepaid units are out there under USDA Section 515 program. So that concludes my presentation on housing quantity. Vince, do we have any questions that I need to address?
Yes, there is one in the chat box. I'd like to know if it is being measured as to how the trend has changed from renting until or so you can save to buy, you know, saving up for a down payment, or renting it because you can't afford it, a home, or because you have credit issues and you can't buy a home. Are we just hearing more from people who always, that has always been the case? Is renting still available at cost-saving options for the lower middle class or working class?
Minnesota rule, unmute yourself and tell us more, because that was 4 questions in one, if you don't mind.
Sorry about that. You did address it to an extent, I believe, as far as how like renting demographics are changing some.
Okay.
And how, you know, predatory lending probably contributed to renting now, and the different, you know, the way renting looks differently, especially in rural areas now.
Okay.
But because I'm not up on all of the research, I am curious as to, is that real change, or is that just change that's getting more attention lately?
I don't think it's just something that's recently. I think this has been followed, and Allison is our data guru. I think this has been measured for quite some time. However, we as educators are now really putting that information out to educate our audiences so that it's not the best kept secret anymore. I don't think this was things that we were talking about 20 or 30 years ago. And I also think that the availability and the quality of data has improved. So now we're able to measure and see things much more clearly than we've been able to do so in the past. But I will let Allison chime in.
Well, I see Kim wants to say something. I think it's the attention also for young people who have now accrued significant student loan debt. And as they are candidates because of their education, and they are able to go into an occupation that should grant them the income and the credit, you know, to be able to have good enough credit to acquire a mortgage. But because of additional debt, there is a hesitancy to take that on. Now that's for a small section of the population. I think that's a little bit newer because of the exorbitant cost of college education. But I every time Kim puts her video on, I know she wants to say something.
Yeah, so I mean, renting, I think it's probably, yeah, like a combination of all the things that we've been talking about. That Urban Institute map is, it's looking at affordable renting needs based on a variety of factors, including like housing production and poverty, persistent poverty and housing quality and overcrowding. So they did use a number of measures. So that is probably looking more at the, you know, lower income in particular and the sort of crisis that they're facing in some areas. But I agree. Like, I think that inability to move into home ownership, the delay in home ownership. So, you know, that people are predictors of home ownership are, you know, getting married and, you know, income and education. And so as student loan debt, so the things that help you get in a position to buy a home right now are also holding people back. And then we also have, you know, people in their 20s and 30s are putting off getting married, which sort of slows down the impetus for home ownership, I think. So it might be delayed. And I think that, yeah, so those are.
Is there a significant increase in the demand for more expensive rentals?
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, there's certainly in urban areas building. So I think there is a perception, at least, that, you know, here, well, actually, and if you go to any major city, you know, there's just like cranes building large, often luxury apartments, you know, everywhere. And so I think there is some data to support that. I don't know what that means for rural, you know, like smaller towns or small cities. And I don't know what that means today. You know, I think what things looked like a year ago might be very different than how they look today. And it might, you know, the COVID crisis might skew more towards staying in rental housing. But whether or not people can afford luxury apartments if we have sustained, you know, economic crises, that it's hard to tell. I mean, certainly, you've watched the news story, a good chunk of renters are not making their payments. You know, I don't think we know the story yet. We don't know the full story yet on what's going to happen with evictions and rental affordability.
And without taking too much time away from our next presenter, there's also still some value to the public housing, housing that's in many rural communities. Well, they're in urban and rural communities, so there is still demand. Most of the housing authorities, at least in our state, have a waiting list for their product because it is one of the lowest rental options for the lower end spectrum for those living in the community. Unfortunately, there's not enough of it. And those folks are now looking at extended stays as an option. And unfortunately, shelters is another place where some of this overflow is going. So when you're looking at the lower end income-wise, the housing authorities, the extended stays, and the shelters are picking up a significant portion of those individuals. And it's not a choice that they want, but it's the only option that they have for a variety of reasons. Their children are going to school there, they have a job there. So I just wanted to point that out. And I saw in the chat box that Joseph had a question about the USDA map. Vince, did you want to answer his question before we turn it over to Kim?
Yes, I did. But before I did, I wanted to tomorrow we're going to be spending a significant amount of time on homebuyer education. And I think the earlier we can get that out to folks, the more informed they are as to what they need to do in order to get qualified. I think there's a lot of people out there that just, even if they're, you know, low income, they think they can never afford a home. And I think there's a piece that we can do as housing experts to change that if they do truly want to own a home, there's a path to home ownership. It may take a little time and everything, but education's key. To the question about Iowa and Nebraska having more USDA programs, one is those states are highly rural, and so there's a lot of opportunity to build multifamily housing in those rural areas versus a state that's obviously more urban in nature. The second thing is where there's active developers. You know, we can have the program availability there, but we need the developers to decide that they want to build in those communities. And so it's kind of a two-edged thing there. Plenty of rural area and an active developer who wants to build a project in those communities.
Thank you, Vince, so much. So as I conclude my housing quantity presentation, I am going to let Kim Scoba from the University of Georgia wrap us up with housing quality.
There we go. So we're asking this question just to get a sense. What do you believe are the top housing quality issues in your community? So
it's looking like our top response is dilapidated housing in need of significant rehab for demolition.
Great. Okay. Well, not great that we have 80% of you saying dilapidated housing, but it does fit in with that helps me to see what areas here to focus on. And so I've lost my screen here. Hold on. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about housing quality, and I'm actually going to end with a little bit more information about what to do or how to identify exterior housing conditions, which it looks like a large portion of you have substandard or dilapidated housing as a problem. So when we think about housing quality, I like to emphasize that the house, it really works as a system and that everything is connected. And the reason I think it's important to keep this in mind is that when you see exterior problems, if there's a hole in the roof or the siding, there's missing siding, that those can create interior problems. And likewise, you can have material and building practices that affect the interior quality and things like air quality. And so, so it's just this process of sort of creating good, maintaining homes, building well, maintaining homes, and then keeping the house as a kind of a healthy balanced system. Age, we've talked a lot about age of housing, and that does to some extent play a role in when we look at housing quality issues. Okay, go on. Next. So when we think, I like to always talk about why things matter. And so when we think about housing quality, you know, there's just a number of aspects that make this a really important issue, and yet sort of an I think in some ways sort of under-recognized component of the housing stock. So when we think about environmental health, people spend most of their time indoors, and especially so right now at a time when we have people, you know, living and working and going to school in their homes. It's really important to have you know, healthy places to live. We look at kind of personal health, so things like you know, having lead paint. So homes that were built before 1976 likely have lead paint. They may have lead plumbing. We have mold issues, and that can be that can apply to new homes too. We build homes really tight. If you've seen homes being constructed, there's that Tyvek wrap, and windows are really energy efficient. And so without some kind of ventilation system, you really can get moisture built up, and it can affect indoor air quality and mold. And then finally, carbon monoxide. You know, if we don't have, you know, certainly know that if systems aren't maintained, you hear, you know, news stories of people, entire families dying of carbon monoxide poisoning, which really could be prevented. And then finally, safety. If homes are not kept up to code, you really risk electrical problems, hazards, fires, and injuries. And I'm always sort of amazed that, you know, you hear stories. When I was living in Wisconsin before I moved to Georgia, there was a story in our small town of a, you know, 5-year-old girl who had been electrocuted in her bathtub because the electrical, you know, wasn't up to code, and the baby sister threw a hairdryer into the tub. And so like, things like that to me should not happen in this day, you know, when we have that, certainly have the ability to bring homes up to a livable standard. Go ahead. So I'm going to talk about exterior issues, and I would say on the housing quality front, this is really more my domain than interior issues. And so look at exterior quality, and I think it's pretty easy to tell. So that poll, you know, if you drive by dilapidated or substandard housing, you know what it is, and you can see those structural deficiencies. You can see if the foundation is sinking. You can see siding, like in this photo, you know, that's been just patched over and over. You may see if the roof, you know, some of the roofing is missing or has been sort of patched over time, broken windows, railings, and floorboards. And all of these things present a couple of problems. So structural problems or inadequate patch siding can create a, you know, problem in terms of moisture or getting in, you know, so it can affect the interior. There's sort of an image of the neighborhood or kind of perceptions if you have a lot of homes that are not maintained. And the point I like to make here is that for housing quality issues, both exterior and interior, small maintenance issues turn into large, expensive problems down the road if they're not remedied. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about housing assessments or windshield surveys as a way of identifying, yeah, I see the question there, as a way of identifying problems and maybe looking for or developing local programs to remedy that. So right, housing quality and deferred maintenance certainly is an affordability issue, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Okay, next. And so I talked about this a little bit, but interior, some of the more common interior quality issues are, you know, lead paint and plumbing, having poor indoor air quality, and then an array of things that are not up to code. So Joy talked about that percentage of the housing stock that does not have indoor plumbing. And so that's sort of a basic, you know, basic need that you would expect all housing to have, or mechanical systems at work. And the problem when things, not having indoor plumbing makes it very hard to have, you know, like proper sanitation. Broken mechanical systems make, you know, present some threats in terms of heating or cooling or carbon monoxide issues. Things like broken or missing smoke detectors, that again is not necessarily related to the age of the house. That's a lot of that is education and awareness. And then, you know, just sanitary conditions and structural hazards. Okay, go ahead. So I've been working quite a bit on this area of housing quality challenges in the state of Georgia, and we've done statewide surveys and found that these are some of the major issues that are facing rural communities in particular. But I've increasingly, as I've primarily spent my time in urban areas before moving to Georgia. But the longer I'm here, the more I see these sort of parallels between distressed urban neighborhoods and distressed housing in rural areas. And so we see these problems with an older housing stock, and then you have this kind of exterior quality issues, as you can see in these two photos. You know, just the porches are sort of falling in. There's, you know, it looks like some moisture problems on the siding on the one. The other is, you know, really pretty severely substandard. And that all links to cost of what it costs to repair for if it's a owner occupied property, it may be that the owner cannot afford to keep up and make what start out as small repairs and over time become really sort of insurmountable repairs. It may be sometimes lack of landlord investments. In Georgia, we have a lot of rural small town homes that are rental properties that are just sort of ignored by the landlords, and they sort of use it as an investment, suck out a lot, extract the resources, and then and sort of move on. And you see that in urban neighborhoods as well. Some of the problem in the South, I think this is a problem in many other states. It's a big problem. Some of it also with owner-occupied property is a result of what's called heirs property. So when a home is passed down with, when the person who owns the home dies and doesn't have a will, it's then sometimes passed on to multiple heirs. And over time, you have many, many people with a stake in one property. And when that happens, you can't sell the home because you don't have a clear title. You can't get, home equity loans. And so the things that, kind of the tools that we have in the toolbox to keep a property up to standards really don't exist. And so it's a really complicated and pervasive problem in the Southeast and requires quite a bit of expertise to untangle it. So I point that out here. As I've talked to people who do work with heir property, they'll tell me it's really a problem that's in nearly every state in the country. And identifying where that is the case is, I think, is part of the step towards remediating some of the conditions here. And then again, lack of affordability and repairs. That really, if you can afford to make repairs, homes will suffer. Okay, go ahead. And so we look at addressing housing quality problems. We've developed in our program a housing assessment and a toolbox, and I'd be happy to share that with anybody. And so what housing assessments are often called windshield surveys or housing condition surveys. They are a sort of systematic process of looking at an area. If you have a small town with 500 housing units or 1,000 units, you might be able to do the whole town. If you're living in a large city, it might be focusing on some neighborhoods where there that might need more investment. And so it's a process of going house by house. We pair that with that tax assessor data that Allison was talking about. And so you get a whole host of sort of data on the property, and then you're adding specific information. So we kind of do a top down. We're only looking from the sidewalk or street, but we look at, what does the roofing material look like? Are there any structural problems? Is the siding okay? Are the windows okay? We identify, so we do this assessment kind of top down of multiple areas of the house, and then it gives you a score at the end that tells, I think it's a 1 to 6 from being dilapidated to fine. And so that gives communities a starting point. So you know what the issue is in and where to focus efforts. And I think for a lot of communities, if you have homes that are maybe not dilapidated and so far down that demolishing them is sort of the most expedient path, you may have the homes that could be addressed. You can put resources in that can save you from those homes from slipping further. And this housing assessment process identifies those that are sort of at risk of more substantial problems. It also identifies where you have vacant homes that are sort of abandoned vacant homes, and then those that are really needing, I said, a greater assessment. And so the communities that use this process here in Georgia, then they've been able to use that data to apply for federal grants and or identify places that need neighborhood cleanups. You can also add other questions. So maybe you want to know, even like if your tax assessor data is accurate, if the addresses match up in real time, you can identify things like that. You can identify where there are sidewalks or where the sidewalks are missing. One community in Georgia went through this process, and just the process of walking through the streets realized that there were a huge number of abandoned tires. And so they were able to access funds to get tired, do a neighborhood cleanup and get rid of tires. It also can help be a source of sort of identifying if there are code enforcement problems. And sort of creating a code enforcement process that doesn't result in the displacement of people, but does sort of, particularly if it's landlord-owned property, to make sure that people are doing right by the property and the people renting from them. And then for homeowners, it might be, if it's an air property, do they need help sort of getting that into a clear title situation so that they can use the wealth and resources from that home, or providing like brush with kindness type of programs, so to do more of the minor kind of repairs that can be done.
So Kim, I wanted to add one thing just from experience. In a lot of our rural places, but not so rural that they have a planning office. The planning office is typically, it's a one-man show. And so it's the planning office and code enforcement. And it's a very undesirable position, right? Everyone knows who you are. It's an uncomfortable position for one individual to be citing and enforcing. And so that then leads to an under citation, right? Because it's sort of like, it's not that big of a deal. It is in fact a code infringement. But we don't want everyone to feel bad about themselves. And so in some places, there are communities that have sort of created a neighborhood code enforcement so that there's no one really to take, and so there are lots of people out there looking for violations, and not just to look for violations, but to look for violations that are really impinging on someone's safety, health, or the value of the land. And so it's a group of people, it's a committee designating the violation, so that it's not just that one poor person who everybody hates. Either they're hated because they don't give out enough violations, or they're hated because they give out all the violations. So it's an unenviable position to be in. So thinking about that as a solution.
Right, and so that's so I'd say that, and you don't want you want code enforcement to be something that makes things better and doesn't create tensions or unfairly, is overly punitive. Georgia has many cities in Georgia have a blight tax, so property taxes go up on rental property that are not maintained, and I think that's been a pretty effective tool. But also, like I said, we have a community-based program, and so it is often the local community working on, what do they want code enforcement to look like, who's going to do that, and so it does sort of avoid some of that like a policing idea that we might associate with code enforcement. But I think keep in mind what do you need to do to keep property that in a safe, habitable condition.
Kim,
go ahead.
Work with a lot of communities that have established land banks, and for those severely blighted properties that are severely delinquent in taxes, and there might be that ownership issue, working with the prosecutor, utilizing foreclosure funds and real estate transfer taxes funding. They've been able to buy up a lot of these properties, get them demolished. Sometimes they've been able to put a new house on the property. Other times they've turned it into a little community park or a community garden. It looks a heck of a lot better than that dilapidated house.
Right, that's a really good point. I don't know if we're talking about land banks and land trusts and all some of the community development tools, but land banking is a great way to take problem properties and get them into a system that can funnel them back into more usable, better sort of resource or better use of the property. I think that's about it for that. Okay, yeah. So actually I had a pretty short segment, and we're probably running ahead of time. So I'd be happy to answer questions, and maybe we can just take broader questions from the day as well. I didn't look at the chat just yet to see. Right, so housing, someone pointed out that leased property on reservations is similar to air property, right? So that property can get divided up into like, you know, hundreds of pieces, you know, where there's many different owners, and it's very similar.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? Any presenters have anything to add?
I have a statement.
Please.
Oh, hi. I'm new to housing, and I'm just, this conversation has been very enlightening to me. And I just want to thank all of the presenters for sharing the information that you did share. But I do have, I guess, a question. Well, maybe not a question or a statement. I guess I just have a concern when it comes to housing. The information that was shared in regards to the number of housing that do not have adequate plumbing in our rural areas, and to see that there's an increase of individuals moving to rural areas versus the urban areas. And in Detroit, I grew up on the east side of Detroit, where there was a lot of homes, big, nice neighborhoods and things of that nature. And then people moved out, and then now you have people moving back in, and then the property value is shooting up. But the cost of living in the suburbs is much more expensive than living in the city. So I'm trying to grasp rural living. We have a lot of rural and agricultural in our area. And I need to learn how to follow the trends of rural, and what does that look like? Because at my community center, we have prevention workers, drug prevention workers, and we're seeing a huge, a lot of activity happening in the rural areas. And I don't know, how does that impact housing when it comes to our prevention education? So I'm trying to marry a lot of cross sections together to actually get an accurate picture of what we're facing in our area. So I don't think that was a question. I think it was just a statement. So I'm here to learn.
Well, I think some of the same problems you face in urban areas we're seeing in rural areas, and they're complicated by lack of density, you know, and well, lack of density. So like access to services is more limited. People might have to drive, or if they don't have a car, you know, yeah. So it's just dispersed out over a much larger area. And so I think some of the benefits of a centralized location in an urban area aren't really feasible in rural areas. And so some of the same programs and services work, but I think the delivery of them is more complicated. I think also that, you know, as people move to rural, there is such a thing as rural gentrification. And so some of the same, you know, tools like community land trusts, things that control, help lower moderate income homeowners in areas where there's speculation or housing becomes sort of a commodity and prices are going up, need to be considered for rural communities too. And so, so if that helps at all.
It did, but I have a general question for those of you who are experts. The American dream, if we were to classify the American dream for housing, what does that look like today?
I will tell you that folks want the 2-story home on 5 acres of land. They don't want any neighbors. They want to be close to restaurants. So they want to be close to all the amenities. They want to maintain the rural landscape of the beautiful farms. And so it's an unrealistic dream. But if you know, I did the survey with some folks who knew the conversation was about preserving, they wanted to preserve their landscape, but yet all of them said, what we really want is we want that giant house. But this is an older population. You know, the ones that are, you know, where rural is an older population, they want that big house. The younger population, their American dream is investing in their downtown buildings and either living there or flipping them and investing in their downtown infrastructure. So it's kind of a bit of a mismatch between the generations.
Yeah.
I think there's also a kind of a dual like track. So I think for lower income, for people who maybe never going to be able to purchase a home, I think, so I study lower income households, and I think that ability to have stability and control over your housing is, which I think are features of home ownership. I think those are going to be the important elements. I think that for some people, achieving the American dream might be being able to find a place that you can call your own. And I have sons in their 20s, and just sort of starting out, and it's we live in a college town, and it's a struggle to rent a 1-bedroom apartment working full time. It's a pretty low quality 1-bedroom apartment, and I think that idea for for my kids to see the house that they grew up in as in their future, I don't know that Allison said, I'm not sure that have the income to support that. I'm not sure if they did that would be their choice. I'm not sure.
One of the problems in rural areas is the lack of broadband, and with people wanting to work remotely, or schools, or telemedicine, and broadband when your housing density is so low, is so cost prohibitive that it really impacts. Do you really want to live in an area that doesn't have broadband? It could be the most beautiful scenery out your back window, but if it doesn't have broadband, you're behind the eight ball right now.
And I do think it's an interesting time, and we'll talk about this just a little bit tomorrow, that during COVID, some rural places are really well situated to welcome new residents who through the pandemic said, you know what, I don't need to live in the city anymore. I can work from wherever. It's expensive. It's not the quality of life I'm trying to achieve. And so I could move out to a rural place and be probably even happier. And then you start looking at where's the broadband, and those places that have it are going to be the winners, and those that don't have it are going to further, I think, kind of cycle downward. And it's just a really interesting time that I don't think we ever predicted. We all knew this was a critical piece for economic development and for attracting households, but to see what is likely going to be a structural shift in kind of population shift, because it'll be very interesting to see. But that's a very good point.
And Allison, I also want to just mention the observation about the American dream, type of housing and things like that. Also, I think it intersects with the young generation also thinking about sustainable development as well.
Very, very true. Yeah, I mean, that was a good question, and I feel kind of stupid for answering it so materialistically when, everyone's dream is a little bit different, but that's true. My daughter, who I did not birth, and people would know that immediately, but she just moved to a farm in Eastern Kentucky, and she's living out of a trailer, and she's growing organic medicinal herbs, not marijuana, but medicinal herbs. And I mean, that's her dream.
Yeah.
Her dream is to live off the land, to grow her own food. She's got a master's degree from University of Michigan. She's very well educated. She bought a trailer for $20,000 in some land, and she couldn't be happier. So yeah, that was a loaded question. What's the American dream? I blame you.
Thank you, everybody. This has been a fabulous discussion, and we're out of time, but please join us tomorrow and bring your friends. We got lots more good information to share tomorrow.